Hello, as we continue our series of videos on editing with DaVinci Resolve, in this video I'm going to look at setting up DaVinci Resolve and one or two of the settings that you really ought to have a look at and think about changing. Hello, welcome to iansstudio. I'm Ian Butterfield. And in this third video about DaVinci Resolve, we're going to look at setting up DaVinci Resolve. Now, DaVinci Resolve is a very powerful program, a very complex program, you might say. But fortunately, the settings, most of the defaults are exactly what we need. But there are one or two settings that I believe you ought to change. So let's head over into Resolve and take a look at them. When you first fire up DaVinci Resolve, it will ask you to create a database. Now, I've already got mine created. You can see it here, IMB DaVinci. But I'm just going to go through the process so you can see what's involved. So I click New Database, a little dialog window comes up. I'll move it over here so it's just that little bit easier to see. You have two options, Connect or Create. Connect allows you to connect to one that you've already got on there, and Create allows you to create a brand new one. There are two types of database, disk-based and SQL-based. You will know when you need an SQL one. It's basically for collaboration. For majority of people, if you're editing by yourself, disk-based one is perfectly fine and the easiest one to set up. So I'm going to select disk on there, and then all you have to do is give it a name. Now, there's a couple of things just to be aware of with the name. It's got to be all lowercase, and in fact, no matter how hard you try to put something in uppercase, it will always come out as lowercase, and you can't have any spaces or strange characters in the name. I always prefix anything that's mine with my initials so that I find it a lot easier to locate on the disk if it's my own work, as opposed to something that's built in. So I'm going to call it IMB, and I am going to call it test database. And then you just specify a location for it. Well, I'm going to go on my local disk under my video project, and I'm going to I'll create actually a folder here called temp, new folder TMP, new folder, call it that, and select that folder and create, and that will just create me a database there. And you can see now I've got my original one up here and the test one down below. So this is what you'll end up with when you first start. You end up with just a single untitled project in there and nothing else. Now, what I recommend is what I've got set up on my live database, if I go over to there, is that you create top-level folders to mirror the folder structure that I showed in the previous video. And you can see on here I've got audition videos, client videos, ones from my dad, things like that. So it mirrors where I'm doing that editing. So for the church one, for example, St Cuthbert's there and St Cuthbert's here. It's a smaller number on there because I've actually split it across two discs, but the two will or should marry up on there. So we've got a project for each item on there. So we've got the top level structure. That's the main thing that you need on this. So I've got a top level structure for St Cuthbert's, a top level one for my Lightroom videos, things like that. Now, there's a couple of settings that you need to be aware of, which will make your life a bit easier with using DaVinci Resolve. And the first one, actually, I'll do it on the test database so that you can see. If I right-click anywhere within here, I've got a couple of options. One that you really need to enable is called Dynamic Project Switching. And that allows you to easily move between projects. You can have more than one project open. Why is that important? Well, that is important because if you want to copy things from one project to another, you really need to have them both open. It just makes life a little bit easier to do that. The next thing that we want to do, we can do on our untitled project, or we can just create a brand new project to do this on. So I'm just going to say new project, and I'm going to create this as a template for all my other projects. I always recommend having a project template. So I'm just going to call this IMB project template and hit create on there. And we come into DaVinci Resolve with an empty project. So what we want to do now is we need to go to the cog down here and set up some default settings. And the ones that we want to look at in here are particularly to do with frame rates. Let me explain what frame rate is. Now, frame rate is the number of, well, a video is made up of a series of still images, one projected one after the other or displayed one after the other. It's like an old flick book. And how many still images per second is the frame rate. Now, what value do we want from that? If I show down timeline frame rate here, you can see lots of different options on there, from 16 all the way up to 120. Now, there's no right and wrong answer to this. It depends where you are in the world. It depends on what you're trying to do, what quality of equipment that you're working with. The default that DaVinci has come up with for this is 24 frames per second. That goes back to the cinematic days. Cinema cameras worked at 24 frames per second, so that has become a bit of a default on there. However, most iPhones, camera phones work at 30 frames per second, which is the default that is used in the States. In the UK, however, there's a very good case for going for 25 frames per second. And this is what I use. I go for 25 frames per second and I set all my cameras to work to that, which means timeline frame rate 25, playback frame rate needs to be 25, video format 25, and I think that covers all of them. It's just the 3 of them that I need to set on there. Why 25 in the UK? Well, the reason is that in the UK, our mains is 50 Hertz. So that means if you've got fluorescent lights, actually I haven't here, although I'm pointing up, all mine are LED ones, but fluorescent lights would flicker at 50 Hertz. Which means if you were photographing under those lighting conditions, you would find that the flicker of the lights was out of sync with the flicker of the camera, the frame rate of the camera, and you could get an odd flickering effect on some video. So the way to avoid it is to make sure you are at multiples of or fractions of 50 Hertz. So in the UK, 25 frames per second is a good one to work with. Now, having said all that, if you're working on a project, for example, the church project that I'm working on, where people are supplying their video footage from their iPhones, the chances are they're going to provide you with 30 frames per second. So it may make sense for you to set everything to 30 frames per second if that's the where all the files are coming in from. Now, you can have different defaults, you can have different templates, one for 25 frames per second, one for 30 frames per second. So the choice is yours. For me, I work at 25 frames per second, and that's what I set everything to. So I'm going to say save on that. But I actually want to go back in there because there's another set to it, which is called presets up here. And we've got one called current project. This is the one I've just set up. So I'm going to save those settings that I have just done as my own preset. And I'm going to call it, again, prefix with my initials, IMB 25 frames per second defaults. So I can do that. And now I can right click on that and save that as my default config, which means any project I now create will have 25 frames, will be set up for 25 frames per second. If I wanted a different frame rate, I could go to, well, system config. Let's see what that one's set at. I load that. And we look at the master settings on there. Yeah, system config is 24 frames per second, which is what we had previously. So I could say under presets, let's save that as IMB 24 frames per second defaults. And okay, so I've got both. So if I was creating a new project and I wanted to set it to 24 frames per second, all I need to do is come into the project settings, go 24 frames per second and load, and my project is set to that current project. But I'm going to make sure that all my defaults are set as 25 because that's how I work. So that's your frame rate settings talked about. So the next thing I want to talk about is about backup and saving. So I cancel out of here and we come up to DaVinci Resolve Preferences. This is different to the cog down in the bottom corner. And in here, under User, Project Save and Load. Now I've already got it set on here, and this is things. You want to make sure Live Save is set, and you want to make sure Project Backups is set. Now I have mine set to perform a backup every 10 minutes, and then it's intelligent backups basically, and then you want to tell it where to save it. Mine is saved on my local drive. I have a folder for those. And why do you want to do this? Well, any bit of software, and I think video software is probably more prone to it than any other, will crash at some point. So doing this, live save means after you've made a change, it will just save the project as you're going along, which means in the event of a crash, you should just be able to load it. The project backups, on the other hand, are useful that if you make a mistake and you need to go back a few steps, as long as you realize, well, within 10 minutes, you can come out and pull up a more recent backup to undo something that you've changed. And for example, I've done an edit on a timeline and I thought I was just working on one area and ended up 2 clips selected, and I completely lost a whole load of edits. So I just abandoned what I was doing, came out, reloaded a backup, and it saved me a whole load of work. So it's always worth having that set on there. So those are the key things that I would advise setting up in DaVinci before you start doing any editing. Next time we're going to look at project templates and how that can simplify your workflow with DaVinci Resolve. Hope you found this video useful, and if you did, please remember to subscribe, and that way you'll be notified when the future videos are released. You'll find on the screen now the playlist of all the videos for our DaVinci Resolve beginners course, and also, once it's released, the next video in this series. So thanks for watching, and until next time, keep making great photos and great videos. Bye for now.